The galaxy was already a maelstrom of war, torn asunder by the endless conflict between the Galactic Republic and the Separatist forces. The Clone Wars had left entire star systems in ruin, cities were reduced to skeletal frames, and the air carried the stench of ozone, molten metal, and the lingering scent of fear. Jedi generals moved like shadows across battlefields, coordinating clone legions while attempting to mediate the fragile political stability that the Republic still clung to. But amid this chaos, an anomaly appeared, one that no Star Destroyer, droid army, or Jedi foresight could have predicted. Far beyond the Outer Rim, in a sector that had seen only sporadic skirmishes and the quiet resilience of local populations, the fabric of space itself began to warp and quiver. A rift tore open in the hyperspace continuum, jagged and pulsating with an eerie luminescence that defied standard sensor readings. The Republic's navicomputers struggled to process the influx of energy, blaring alarms that went unheeded by those who did not yet comprehend the magnitude of the event. From this rupture emerged a vessel of impossible scale and design, an organic yet engineered monstrosity that shimmered with flowing, living metal. The surface rippled as though breathing, light and shadow moving in tandem across its biomechanical architecture, casting distorted reflections on the nearby planets. It descended slowly, deliberately, as though aware of every detail below, the forests, rivers, and cities that existed at the edge of the galaxy. When it touched the upper atmosphere of Ryloth, the planet trembled as if acknowledging a force far beyond the Republic's comprehension. On the surface, Twi'lek civilians froze in awe and terror, watching enormous forms emerge from the vessel. These were the engineers, beings of such colossal stature and incomprehensible anatomy that even Jedi who had faced Sith lords and galactic tyrants could scarcely fathom their presence. Their skin, pale and almost translucent, shimmered with iridescent patterns, and their limbs moved with a fluid grace that belied their immense mass. Biomechanical constructs followed them, towering entities whose movements were precise and silent, designed for both construction and annihilation with equal efficiency. The hum of their passage resonated in the core of the planet itself, a vibration that unsettled even the most stoic clone troopers observing from above. When the clones reported the phenomenon back to Republic Command, communications struggled to make sense of what sensors could barely detect. Multiple readings suggested that the engineers were not merely physical beings, they carried with them a type of energy that warped the fundamental laws of matter, a resonance that subtly interfered with the Force itself. Master Yoda, meditating in the Jedi Temple, felt the disturbance as a tremor in the Force, a presence both ancient and alien that the Jedi had no precedent to understand. The Council convened urgently, considering every contingency for an incursion of this magnitude. Even seasoned warriors like Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker felt the disquieting pull of an unknown authority, one that transcended morality, loyalty, and even the conventional definitions of war. Their mission was unclear, reconnaissance was imperative, but caution had never been more critical. The engineers were not attackers in the conventional sense. They did not fire upon the Jedi, nor did they emit aggression, but the sheer scale and alien logic of their presence demanded vigilance. As the rift stabilized, the Republic scrambled fleets toward the sector, dispatching both Jedi-led reconnaissance ships and the most advanced clone battalions. Even the Separatists detected the anomaly, and Count Dooku's communications were filled with anxious deliberations. The Sith Lord was intrigued, sensing a power that could be manipulated, yet the readings were inconsistent, suggesting a civilization that did not obey the known rules of physics or the Force. Droid commanders hesitated, their programming unable to reconcile the intelligence from multiple sources that contradicted all operational logic. Meanwhile, the engineers continued their slow, measured movement across the surface of Ryloth. Structures began to shift, not in destruction but in reformation. The engineers' presence altered terrain, reshaped landscapes, and infused the environment with strange biochemical energy. Rivers swelled and shimmered, forests mutated into alien variants of flora that glowed faintly in the twilight. Clones attempting to engage with them found their blasters less effective, as the engineers' very biology seemed to absorb and redirect energy with effortless efficiency. Even lightsabers, elegant weapons of the Jedi, interacted differently near their forms. Master Mace Windu, observing from a distant vantage point, felt a subtle resistance in the Force when approaching their energy signature, as if the fabric connecting all living beings was being manipulated by an external hand. The first encounter occurred not in combat but in observation. Anakin and Obi-Wan's ships approached the rift cautiously, scanning for any trace of hostility. The engineers seemed aware of every movement, their heads tilting in synchronized calculation, their biomechanical constructs analyzing the Jedi vessels as if they were specimens in a controlled experiment. The clones attempted to maintain formation, but a growing unease permeated their ranks. They had faced super battle droids, the legendary General Grievous, and countless separatist traps, yet this presence instilled a deeper, existential fear. On the ground, Twi'lek civilians whispered tales that had no precedent, speaking of gods walking silently as they observed the engineers' deliberate motions. The Jedi debated how to proceed. Was this a threat to be neutralized? An intelligence to be studied? Or something far more dangerous? A civilization whose goals were incomprehensible, whose actions could alter the very balance of life and power in the galaxy? Communication attempts were made, but the engineers emitted no response in any known form. Their presence alone was the statement: dominance, comprehension, and evolution beyond the galaxy's existing civilizations. Meanwhile, the rift itself pulsed intermittently, a visual rhythm that seemed to coordinate with the engineers' actions. Republic intelligence speculated that this was a conduit, possibly for more beings of their kind or a mechanism to reshape planetary systems. Jedi Masters debated the potential consequences. If the engineers had arrived fully aware of galactic politics, could they ally with one faction, or would their motives render all existing conflicts irrelevant? The Separatists, equally perplexed, considered withdrawal, realizing that conventional military might was useless against a force that did not abide by the known laws of warfare. Count Dooku sent reconnaissance droids to probe, only to have them absorbed into the engineers' biomechanical technology and repurposed almost instantaneously, the droids' systems overwritten and redirected in ways that confounded Separatist engineers. Holographic transmissions showed the droids performing tasks far beyond their original programming, functioning as extensions of the engineers rather than autonomous units. This display of efficiency and power left both the Jedi and Separatists reconsidering any assumptions about supremacy in this sector. Back on Ryloth, the engineers began a methodical exploration of the planet's major cities and installations. Their focus was not immediate destruction, but adaptation and integration on a scale that humans and Twi'leks could not fathom. Buildings were repurposed almost instantaneously, the materials reshaped into new structures that seemed alive, resonating faintly with an energy that disrupted communications, weaponry, and even the clones' internal systems. Civilians fled or hid, their survival instincts clashing with the overwhelming inevitability of the engineers' influence. Jedi observing these changes noted that the Force itself was being subtly manipulated. The life energies of the planet's inhabitants, the mineral composition of the soil, and even the flow of the atmosphere were all in some way altered by the engineers' presence. It was a power beyond conventional Force comprehension, and yet there was a precision, a logic to it that suggested an intelligence operating on an entirely alien plane of thought. Anakin and Obi-Wan debated strategy, knowing that conventional engagement would be futile. Attempts to rally clone troops into coordinated strikes were abandoned after the first wave encountered rapid environmental adaptation. Blaster fire that had previously devastated enemy droids now ricocheted harmlessly or was absorbed into the surrounding terrain. The Jedi were forced to acknowledge that the engineers' methodology did not mirror aggression in a way that could be countered directly. Their movements were calculated, deliberate, and guided by an understanding of biology, physics, and energy that the galaxy had not yet encountered. It became clear that any attempt to negotiate, attack, or even observe without consequence would require ingenuity beyond Jedi training. The Council authorized more intensive reconnaissance, deploying Jedi sensitive to both the Force and the subtle shifts in dimensional energy, but even these seasoned masters struggled to detect motives or intent. Across multiple star systems, rumors began to spread of the engineers' arrival. Hollow communications between Republic sectors carried fragmented reports of towering figures, biomechanical constructs, and planets subtly reshaped in ways that defied natural laws. Some senators panicked, calling for immediate military response, while others urged caution, recognizing that an unknown civilization might either be the greatest ally or the most catastrophic adversary imaginable. The Separatists, though initially intrigued by potential opportunities, found themselves powerless to predict the engineers' movements, their droid armies rendered ineffective by environmental adaptation and rapid biomechanical analysis. Count Dooku, sensing that the balance of the Clone Wars had been fundamentally altered, contemplated whether to exploit the engineers' presence or retreat entirely to avoid confrontation with forces beyond his comprehension. As the first 24 hours passed, the scale of the engineers' impact became unmistakable. Entire planetary ecosystems were subtly altered, rivers carried faint luminescence, flora emitted new chemical signals, and the very air vibrated with an energy signature that interfered with starship engines and communications. Clone troops reported unease, as if the very ground beneath them had consciousness, responding to their presence and recalibrating environmental factors against them. Jedi Masters, feeling the disturbance in the Force, realized that their usual techniques of precognition, diplomacy, and combat strategy were being challenged on an unprecedented level. Even Master Yoda, with centuries of experience, acknowledged that these beings represented a paradigm shift, entities whose objectives and logic could not be predicted using conventional understanding of the Force or galactic mechanics. Every decision made by the Jedi, clones, and even Separatists had to account for the engineers' incomprehensible intelligence. Hyperspace routes were rerouted, communication channels disrupted, and planetary defenses rendered almost meaningless as the engineers reshaped matter at the molecular level. The Republic's political machinery strained under the weight of uncertainty, the Senate debating contingency plans while Jedi leaders grappled with the necessity of observation over engagement. And through it all, the engineers moved with deliberate calm, their every action resonating with a purpose that suggested observation, analysis, and, perhaps, judgment. The galaxy, embroiled in war, now faced an existential question. The Clone Wars were no longer the ultimate measure of power. In the presence of the engineers, every battle, every strategy, every allegiance would need re-evaluation. The Star Wars galaxy had been introduced to an entirely new dimension of influence, a force that neither Republic, Separatist, nor Jedi could fully anticipate or understand. If you want to see more characters enter the Star Wars galaxy, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. The Republic fleet moved cautiously through the Outer Rim, the shimmering pulse of hyperspace rifts still fresh in the navigational displays. Jedi generals spread thin across multiple fronts had to adapt quickly, rerouting their forces to monitor the region affected by the engineers' arrival. Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker led a squadron of ARC-170 fighters and Venator-class Star Destroyers, cautiously observing the biomechanical vessel that hovered over Rylotha's northern continent. Sensors were unreliable, readings fluctuated wildly as the engineers' craft emitted waves of energy that distorted both matter and the Force, making conventional detection impossible. The Jedi had faced unpredictability before, Count Dooku's manipulations, grievous terror campaigns, even the dark shadow of Sidious, but nothing could compare to the sheer otherworldly nature of the engineers. There was no aggression yet, no direct assault, but the presence alone was threatening in a way that bypassed traditional measures of military power. Clone troopers, trained to follow strict tactical protocols, found themselves hesitating, their instincts conflicted by environmental anomalies, air that felt denser, gravity slightly shifted, and strange pheromonal signals from the engineers that humans and Twi'leks could barely comprehend. As the Jedi coordinated observations, they realized the engineers' focus was not merely planetary but systematic. Scans revealed that their biomechanical constructs were actively reshaping urban environments, converting traditional buildings into hybrid structures that pulsated with living energy. Factories and government complexes restructured themselves with precision, roads morphed into conduits of strange bioluminescent material, and rivers carved new paths as if guided by an unseen hand. The clones' attempts to intervene failed catastrophically, blaster fire was absorbed or redirected, while the environment itself shifted to impede their progress. Jedi sensed the Force interacting differently near these beings. Subtle, almost imperceptible distortions that made telekinesis more taxing and precognition less reliable. Yoda, from the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, felt these tremors like distant echoes. A presence so vast, so alien, it was as if the galaxy itself was being subtly rewritten. The Masters debated the best course of action. Engagement was risky, yet inaction risked allowing a civilization with incomprehensible power to reshape the Outer Rim according to its own agenda. Meanwhile, the Separatists scrambled to comprehend the anomaly. Count Dooku sent multiple reconnaissance droids into the region, only to witness the same fate as earlier attempts. The machines were absorbed, reprogrammed, and repurposed in ways that defied Separatist understanding. The droids returned to the Separatist command not as spies but as active agents of the Engineers' influence, executing tasks that undermined Dooku's plans and sowed confusion among the droid ranks. The Sith Lord, who thrived on manipulation and control, found himself outmaneuvered without even direct confrontation. Grievous, stationed nearby with his forces, was equally perplexed. His droid legions failed to maintain cohesion in the presence of the Engineers' pervasive energy, leaving him powerless to project fear or force compliance. Across both the Republic and Separatist fleets, a singular realization emerged. The Engineers' arrival had rendered conventional warfare inadequate, and their motives remained entirely opaque. On the ground, Anakin and Obi-Wan deployed a small contingent of clone forces to observe and report. The clones, initially confident in their standard tactics, encountered immediate obstacles. Entire neighborhoods restructured themselves within moments. Streets shifted, buildings elongated or collapsed selectively, and bioluminescent growths emitted signals that interfered with sensors. Clones attempted to engage, but every shot redirected or absorbed, every maneuver anticipated with eerie precision. Jedi attempted to intervene using the Force, but even telekinesis was met with resistance. Objects seemed to have a life of their own, moving in ways that suggested the Engineers' bioengineering extended to environmental manipulation. Obi-Wan attempted to reach the nearest Engineer, hoping that communication or demonstration of peaceful intent might yield understanding, but as he approached, the being remained silent, observing, its eyes reflecting a depth of intelligence and detachment that unsettled even the most experienced Jedi. The Engineers themselves moved with deliberate grace, their every action measured. They collected samples from the environment, analyzed the clones' reactions, and occasionally manipulated structures or flora with exact precision. Despite the apparent neutrality, tension was mounting on both sides. Jedi debated whether this observation was in preparation for an assault or merely a form of experimentation. Anakin, impatient as ever, urged a more direct approach, advocating for attempts to test the limits of the Engineers' capabilities. Obi-Wan counseled restraint, warning that premature engagement might provoke unpredictable consequences. Across the battlefield, clone commanders found themselves torn between following orders and reacting instinctively to the surreal changes around them. Blaster fire, while seemingly ineffective, occasionally prompted localized environmental shifts that revealed subtle weaknesses in the Engineers' manipulation, but every success came at a cost, forcing the clones to adapt in real time to an adversary that appeared both omniscient and unconcerned with conventional logic. Amid these tactical concerns, political ramifications rippled through the Republic Senate. News of the Engineers' arrival spread slowly at first, then rapidly as communications improved. Senators argued furiously over the correct course of action. Should they treat the Engineers as a threat to be contained, an intelligence to be studied, or potential allies whose understanding of biology and energy could provide an unprecedented advantage against the Separatists? Some feared that the mere presence of such beings could destabilize entire planetary systems, rewriting the balance of power in unpredictable ways. Others urged cautious observation, arguing that the Engineers' detachment from the galaxy's conflicts might be leveraged without direct confrontation. Jedi Masters were called to provide assessments, with their reports emphasizing both the threat and the mystery of the Engineers' motives. Yoda cautioned that attempting to predict their actions with conventional methods would be fruitless, that patience and observation were necessary to understand the full scope of their abilities. In the Outer Rim, local populations experienced unprecedented phenomena. Twi'lek communities reported that rivers glowed faintly at night, forests emitted subtle harmonic frequencies, and some settlers claimed to hear whispers carried on the wind, messages unintelligible yet eerily coherent in cadence. Clone troopers on patrol described a sensation of being watched, not in the conventional sense, but as if every movement was being recorded, analyzed, and subtly countered. Jedi assigned to study these effects noted that the Force itself was interacting unusually with the engineer's presence. Midichlorian readings fluctuated in unpredictable patterns, precognitive visions blurred, and attempts at Force meditation yielded only fragmented insights. The implication was clear: the engineers operated on a level that transcended the known parameters of the Force, and any strategy to engage them had to consider not just physical confrontation but a fundamental recalibration of understanding. Attempts at direct communication failed. Holo transmissions, lightsaber demonstrations, and even attempts to interface through droid intermediaries yielded no discernible response. The engineers observed, adapted, and continued their systematic reshaping of the environment. Clones attempted to map the anomalies, only to have terrain shift unpredictably beneath their feet. Starships sent for reconnaissance found themselves forced into new flight patterns, their navicomputers unable to maintain reliable routes through regions affected by the engineers' energy fields. Jedi sensed a form of intelligence that was analytical, detached, and unaligned with either the light or dark sides. It was not malevolent in the conventional sense, nor benevolent. It existed with a purpose beyond the galaxy's comprehension, guided by principles that no Jedi, Sith, or Senator could interpret fully. Despite the apparent neutrality, the mere presence of the engineers created a palpable tension across the galaxy. Republic and Separatist forces were forced to reconsider traditional strategies, re-evaluate alliances, and adapt to a new scale of influence. Battles that would normally be decided by tactics and firepower were now influenced by an external intelligence capable of reshaping the very battlefield in real time. Jedi Masters debated whether intervention was necessary, with some arguing that observation would yield greater insight, while others insisted that preemptive action might be the only way to prevent future catastrophe. Clones adapted to new orders, but unease persisted. Their training had not prepared them for an adversary that could manipulate not just matter but the very laws governing life and energy. Meanwhile, the engineers' methodical exploration continued. Urban centers, military installations, and natural ecosystems were altered incrementally, almost imperceptibly at first, then with increasing significance. The clones' attempts to halt or redirect their influence proved largely ineffective, while Jedi struggled to reconcile their knowledge of the Force with these alien capabilities. Observations revealed that the engineers' manipulation extended beyond physical matter. Environmental chemistry, gravitational fields, and even biological processes were subtly affected, suggesting a level of scientific mastery that merged biological engineering with advanced energy manipulation. This realization forced both Republic and Separatist leaders to acknowledge a disturbing truth. The Clone Wars, monumental though they were, now existed within a far larger context, one dominated by entities whose goals and ethics could not be anticipated. As the day drew to a close, both Jedi and military strategists understood the enormity of the challenge. The engineers were not an army in the traditional sense, yet their presence commanded immediate, strategic consideration. Attempts to engage directly risked catastrophic failure, while inaction allowed the engineers' influence to grow unchecked. Even the smallest planetary systems now lay within the sphere of their impact, and the subtle alterations in terrain, environment, and biological matter hinted at long-term consequences that could affect the balance of power across the entire galaxy. Jedi reports emphasized the need for vigilance, adaptability, and understanding. These beings were not merely a threat, but a test of the galaxy's ability to confront forces beyond comprehension. In the shadow of Rylotha's transformed landscapes, with glowing rivers and mutating forests bearing silent witness, it became abundantly clear that the Star Wars galaxy had been irrevocably altered. The Clone Wars had entered a new phase, not defined by Republic versus Separatist conflict, but by the enigmatic presence of an intelligence whose very existence challenged the core principles of life, war, and the Force itself. The Republic's initial caution soon gave way to a more proactive strategy as the full scale of the Engineers' presence became apparent. Jedi generals coordinated efforts across multiple sectors, dispatching reconnaissance teams to chart the biomechanical transformations underway on various Outer Rim planets. Anakin Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi, alongside a small contingent of elite clones, were tasked with surveying a cluster of systems near Ryloth, where the Engineers' influence was most pronounced. The crew's approach was measured, with scouts sent ahead to map the shifting terrain, but even the most advanced sensors could not fully penetrate the adaptive nature of the Engineers' creations. Buildings would elongate and twist, forests would reorient their growth patterns, and rivers would alter their courses with near-instantaneous precision. Attempts to land on affected planets were fraught with risk, as atmospheric conditions fluctuated unpredictably, and local wildlife, modified subtly by the Engineers' manipulations, displayed behaviors that defied known biological models. Clones found themselves facing predatory creatures that could camouflage perfectly against the biomechanical environment or emit disabling bioelectric pulses. Jedi tried to establish a method of communication, initially through conventional holotransmissions, then via Force-mediated attempts. Yoda and Mace Windu meditated intensely, attempting to sense the intentions of the Engineers. The results were puzzling. The Engineers emitted a kind of energy that resonated with the Force but did not align to the light or dark side. When Jedi tried to probe their consciousness, they felt a vast, structured intelligence, deliberate and methodical, yet incomprehensibly alien. Anakin, ever impetuous, pushed for more aggressive measures, suggesting that a direct demonstration of Force prowess might establish contact or command respect. Obi-Wan, cautious as ever, countered that this could provoke a reaction whose scale could overwhelm both clones and Jedi. The debate illustrated the tension between initiative and prudence, and it mirrored the broader uncertainty gripping the Republic leadership. How does one respond to an entity that operates on a level of understanding far beyond conventional military or mystical strategies? Meanwhile, Separatist forces observed the same phenomena with a mix of curiosity and alarm. Count Dooku attempted to incorporate the Engineers' presence into his political calculus, sending waves of droids to study and, if possible, exploit the changes. Yet every droid dispatched was reprogrammed, repurposed, or neutralized without any obvious intervention. Grievous, commanding a regional fleet, discovered that even his most loyal battle droids could not operate efficiently near areas influenced by the Engineers. Tactical coordination faltered as biomechanical transformations altered flight paths, sensor arrays, and the structural integrity of starbases. The Separatists' advantage in automation, which had previously overwhelmed planetary defenses, now became a liability. The Engineers' presence negated conventional military superiority, turning brute force into a fragile and unpredictable tool. Back within the Republic's ranks, Jedi Masters debated the philosophical implications of the Engineers' intrusion. Was their presence a test, an observation, or a precursor to something more invasive? Some argued that the Engineers' advanced manipulation of biology and energy could provide unprecedented benefits if properly understood, suggesting that cooperation might be possible. Others, however, feared the consequences of attempting to integrate alien intelligence with Republic systems. What guarantee existed that the Engineers' objectives would align with sentient life in the galaxy? Obi-Wan emphasized caution, recognizing the risk of overstepping boundaries that were beyond human or Force comprehension. Anakin, struggling with impatience and a desire to prove his decisiveness, increasingly viewed these deliberations as wasted time, an opportunity for the enemy, or for understanding, slipping away. The Engineers themselves maintained a deliberate silence. Observation revealed that their energy fields could reshape the environment with astonishing speed, yet they did not engage directly in hostilities. Instead, they created and modified constructs that interacted with their surroundings in subtle ways. Plant life would develop enhanced resilience, terrain would shift to create natural barriers, and entire urban centers would be restructured according to unknown patterns. It was not a simple act of engineering. It was a deliberate recalibration of planetary ecosystems, as though each location were being readjusted to meet an internal blueprint. The Republic's attempts to interfere were consistently foiled by this adaptability. Jedi could push objects or attempt to influence terrain with the Force, but their efforts were met with immediate and precise counterbalancing. Blaster fire redirected, gravitation subtly shifted, and local wildlife became active participants in the Engineers' restructuring. Anakin and Obi-Wan led a daring reconnaissance mission to a partially transformed city on Ryloth. They descended in low-orbit fighters, scanning for evidence of intelligent interaction. As they entered the atmosphere, they witnessed structures that had shifted to create vast, open conduits that pulsed with living energy. Roads twisted impossibly, bridges arched in impossible formations, and vegetation grew in ways that suggested directed intention rather than random mutation. Clones disembarking found themselves navigating a maze that reconfigured itself with every turn. Jedi sensed that the Engineers were not hostile yet, but the environment itself acted as a barrier, a form of defense that bypassed conventional combat. The city became a living entity, its biomechanical nature operating in tandem with the Engineers' silent observation. Attempts at direct dialogue proved impossible. Even Force-sensitive communication yielded only partial understanding. Yoda's meditation suggested an intelligence that was vast, disciplined, and intentionally inscrutable. While the Jedi could perceive a purpose behind the Engineers' actions, the scale and method of their operations were fundamentally alien. The Force itself responded unusually, energy flows were redirected, perception of time became irregular in certain zones, and Jedi found precognitive visions fragmenting into incoherent possibilities. Obi-Wan remarked that these were not beings to be feared in a traditional sense, they were not malevolent, but their capabilities demanded a new form of strategic thinking. Anakin, frustrated by the lack of tangible confrontation, sought ways to engage indirectly, attempting to manipulate the environment with the Force to test the limits of their adaptability. At the same time, the galaxy's political structure strained under the weight of this unprecedented phenomenon. Senators debated in the halls of Coruscant, arguing over the proper response to beings whose presence defied categorization as enemy or ally. Some advocated cautious study, suggesting that the Engineers' technology and understanding of life could provide advantages against the Separatists. Others warned that any attempt to influence or co-opt them could trigger unforeseen consequences, possibly destabilizing entire sectors. Jedi reports highlighted the complexity of the situation, stressing that traditional metrics of threat assessment, fleet strength, troop numbers, political allegiance, were inadequate when confronted with a species that could alter matter, biology, and environmental energy in near-instantaneous fashion. Local populations, caught in the transformation, displayed varied reactions. Twi'leks reported cities changing before their eyes, rivers rerouting, and forests growing in ways that created new paths and obstacles. Many were awed, interpreting the changes as divine intervention or spiritual phenomena, while others were terrified, viewing the Engineers as harbingers of destruction. Clone commanders struggled to maintain morale, balancing the need for observation with the inherent danger of navigating shifting landscapes and unpredictable biological anomalies. Jedi accompanied them, providing guidance and protection while attempting to understand the deeper implications of the Engineers' presence. In parallel, Separatist intelligence networks attempted to exploit weaknesses in the Engineers' adaptation processes, only to find that their methods were ineffective. Droid networks sent to study or disrupt the Engineers were systematically integrated or neutralized. Count Dooku, who had grown accustomed to manipulating opponents through subtle strategy, realized that the Engineers' operations existed on a level that rendered conventional manipulation obsolete. Grievous, too, experienced frustration as his pre-programmed strategies faltered against an adversary that did not conform to expected patterns of conflict. The Outer Rim, once a theater of calculated battle, had become an unpredictable stage dominated by intelligence and power beyond either faction's comprehension. Amid these strategic, political, and environmental developments, the Engineers continued their silent work, reshaping ecosystems and structures with unwavering precision. Jedi Masters noted subtle patterns. growth and reorganization appeared to follow principles of energy efficiency, ecological balance, and structural integrity that were alien yet elegantly systematic. Every alteration suggested a long-term plan, a vision that encompassed entire planetary systems rather than isolated sectors. The Republic began to realize that the engineers' arrival was not merely a random event. It was a purposeful intervention that challenged not only the Clone Wars' tactical norms but the galaxy's understanding of life, adaptation, and intelligence itself. By the fourth standard day since the engineers' arrival, the Clone Wars had effectively stalled in multiple outer rim sectors. Engagements that would normally have erupted into full-scale planetary assaults instead dissolved into uneasy ceasefires, as both Republic and Separatist commanders recalibrated their priorities. The war, once defined by territory and ideology, now existed in the shadow of something far more profound. Reports streamed into Coruscant describing entire ecosystems restructured with mathematical precision. Agricultural worlds found their soil enriched beyond natural capacity, while industrial hubs saw machinery subtly altered to operate with greater efficiency. The engineers were not simply reshaping landscapes, they were optimizing them. This realization fractured opinion within the Jedi Council. Master Mace Windu argued that such intervention, however beneficial on the surface, represented an unacceptable manipulation of sovereign systems. The Force, in his view, thrived on balance achieved through natural cycles, not imposed order from an alien intelligence. Master Yoda, however, perceived a more nuanced pattern. In deep meditation, he sensed not conquest, but correction, a deliberate recalibration of imbalances long festering beneath the surface of galactic civilization. Where pollution had poisoned oceans, waters now ran clear. Where overmining had hollowed planetary crusts, structural integrity was restored. It was as if the engineers were diagnosing the galaxy itself and applying remedies without consultation. Anakin Skywalker interpreted these developments differently. To him, power that could end suffering so efficiently was not inherently a threat, it was an opportunity. Standing within a partially transformed city on Ryloth, watching as fractured infrastructure reassembled into seamless, living architecture, he felt a stirring of possibility. What if the engineers could end the war entirely? What if their technology could neutralize the Separatist threat in a single calculated gesture? Obi-Wan cautioned him sharply. Power without understanding, he reminded Anakin, often carried unintended consequences. The engineers had not declared allegiance. They had not communicated intent. To assume benevolence was as dangerous as assuming hostility. The first undeniable escalation occurred not through aggression, but resistance. A rogue Separatist commander, unwilling to accept the paralysis of his campaign, launched a concentrated assault on a transformed sector near Selukami. Waves of droid bombers descended upon an engineer-modified landscape, unleashing plasma bombardments designed to overwhelm adaptive defenses. For a brief moment, it appeared successful. Explosions rippled across biomechanical structures, and plumes of smoke darkened the sky. Then the terrain responded. The ground itself liquefied beneath advancing droid columns, reshaping into viscous channels that swallowed machinery whole. Energy pulses surged upward, disabling entire squadrons mid-flight. Within minutes, the Separatist assault force was neutralized, not destroyed in fiery spectacle, but absorbed, dismantled, and repurposed with surgical efficiency. Republic observers, witnessing the event from orbit, fell into stunned silence. The engineers had demonstrated defensive capability on a scale that rendered fleet-based warfare obsolete. No counterattack followed. No pursuit. The engineers simply resumed their restructuring, as though the assault had been a minor variable in a larger equation. News of the failed offensive reached Count Dooku swiftly. The Sith Lord recognized the strategic catastrophe. The engineers were not merely resistant to attack, they adapted in real time, turning opposition into raw material. This was not an enemy to provoke recklessly. Even Darth Sidious, observing events from Coruscant's highest towers, recalculated his long game. The Clone Wars had always been a means to an end, a crucible through which he would forge an empire. But the engineers represented an unpredictable disruption to that design. Their capacity to stabilize systems and neutralize conflict threatened to undermine the very chaos upon which his ascent depended. Within the Republic's Senate, debate intensified. Some senators proposed formal diplomatic outreach, arguing that a civilization capable of such miracles might be reasoned with. Others demanded containment, fearing that continued transformation would erode planetary autonomy. Bail Organa advocated cautious engagement, emphasizing that hostility had yielded nothing but humiliation for the Separatists. The Jedi Council ultimately agreed to attempt a direct envoy, not with weapons, but with open dialogue. Anakin and Obi-Wan were chosen to lead the mission. Accompanied by a small delegation of clones and scholars, they approached the largest engineer construct yet observed, a towering spire of living alloy that pulsed with harmonic resonance. As they disembarked, the environment shifted subtly, forming a clear path toward the structure's base. The gesture was unmistakable. They were being allowed entry. Inside, gravity fluctuated gently, guiding rather than disorienting them. Walls shimmered with translucent energy, revealing glimpses of planetary schematics, maps not of political borders, but of ecological networks and energy flows. At the chamber's center stood an engineer, taller than any encountered before. Its gaze settled upon the Jedi, not with menace, but with profound scrutiny. Obi-Wan stepped forward, offering a respectful bow. Through a combination of spoken language, holographic projection, and subtle force expression, he conveyed the Republic's desire for understanding. For several long moments, there was no response. Then the chamber illuminated. Images cascaded around them, war-torn planets, polluted atmospheres, devastated ecosystems, followed by projections of restored environments under engineer influence. The message was stark and unambiguous. The galaxy was diseased. The engineers were the remedy. Anakin felt a surge of conflicting emotion. The vision was undeniable. Entire worlds healed in moments. Suffering ended with clinical precision. But at what cost? Free will? Cultural identity? The engineer extended a hand toward a holographic representation of Coruscant. The image shifted, revealing pollution dissipating, undercity decay reversed, infrastructure optimized. It was a promise and a warning. Obi-Wan sensed the deeper implication. The engineers did not seek permission because they did not recognize political sovereignty as relevant. Their mandate was systemic balance, not ideological alignment. To them, the Clone Wars were a symptom, not a defining conflict. When the Jedi returned to Coruscant with their account, the Council was divided more sharply than ever. Acceptance of engineer intervention could end the war and heal countless worlds. Resistance could preserve autonomy but risk annihilation. The Force itself felt strained, as though awaiting a choice that would redefine its expression across the galaxy. Meanwhile, in the shadows of power, Darth Sidious contemplated an unprecedented possibility. If the engineers could reshape reality itself, perhaps they could be manipulated or eliminated. For the first time in decades, his confidence wavered. The grand design of Sith Dominion faced a variable beyond calculation. Across the stars, the engineers continued their work, silent and inexorable. The galaxy stood at a crossroads, not between Republic and Separatist, nor light and dark, but between self-determined chaos and imposed harmony. And as hyperspace lanes shimmered with the afterglow of transformation, one truth became undeniable. The Clone Wars were no longer the central story of the era. The future would be decided by whether the galaxy chose to resist its own correction or surrender to it. The revelation carried back from the engineer spire did not bring clarity to the galaxy. It fractured it. Words spread carefully at first, confined to the Jedi Council chamber and select members of the Senate, but secrets of that magnitude never remained contained for long. When fragments of the holographic projections leaked, images of Coruscant cleansed of pollution, the undercity restored, planetary infrastructures perfected, public opinion shifted with dangerous speed. Entire sectors, exhausted by years of war, began to ask a forbidden question. If the engineers could end suffering in a single calculated intervention, why should they be resisted? On Coruscant, protests erupted not in anger, but in desperate hope. Citizens of the lower levels, long abandoned to decay and crime, demanded that the Republic accept engineer assistance. Hellenic commentators debated sovereignty versus survival. Was freedom meaningful if it preserved inequality and endless conflict? Or was imposed harmony a mercy the galaxy could no longer afford to reject? The Jedi Council convened in emergency session. Mace Windu's voice was firm, unwavering. The engineer's logic was cold, he argued, efficient, but devoid of compassion as the Jedi understood it. Balance achieved through external imposition was not true balance. It was control. Kadimundi countered that the Force itself seemed undisturbed by the engineers' actions. There was no surge of darkness accompanying their corrections, no corruption radiating outward. Yoda remained contemplative, sensing currents too complex for immediate judgment. The Force flowed differently where the engineers worked, calmer in some respects, quieter in others, but not inherently twisted. That ambiguity was more troubling than outright malevolence. Anakin Skywalker found himself increasingly isolated in his perspective. To him, the debate felt detached from reality. He had seen the projections. He had felt the structured certainty within the engineer construct. These beings were not tyrants reveling in dominance. They were architects executing a design. The war had slaughtered billions. Entire systems starved while politicians debated procedure. If the engineers could end it, why cling to a broken status quo? His frustration simmered beneath outward composure, feeding doubts he had long harbored about the Republic's inefficiency and the Jedi Order's restraint. Obi-Wan sensed the turmoil in his former Padawan but struggled to redirect it. He understood Anakin's desire to alleviate suffering, he shared it. Yet he also perceived the unseen cost. The engineers' visions had not included dissent. They had not accounted for cultural variance, spiritual diversity, or the unpredictable beauty of organic development. Their restored galaxy was immaculate, but uniform. Optimized ecosystems left little room for chaos, and chaos, Obi-Wan believed, was inseparable from freedom. The Separatist Council, observing the Republic's internal fracture, seized upon the unrest. Propaganda broadcasts framed the engineers as proof of the Republic's weakness. They cannot govern without alien intervention, declared one transmission from Mustafar. Yet behind closed doors, the Separatist leadership was equally divided. Some corporate leaders saw opportunity in adaptation, imagining profits from reverse engineering engineer biotechnology. Others feared obsolescence. A civilization capable of restructuring entire planetary supply chains in moments rendered traditional economic leverage meaningless. Count Dooku, ever the strategist, sought a more direct solution. If the engineers could not be manipulated politically, perhaps they could be studied through the Force. In secret meditation chambers, he reached outward, probing for the structured consciousness Obi-Wan had described. What he encountered unsettled him. The engineer's presence in the Force was vast and geometric, like an intricate lattice extending across systems. It did not resist him aggressively, it simply redirected his influence, diffusing it into patterns he could not unravel. For the first time since embracing the dark side, Dooku felt small. Darth Sidious reacted differently. Where Dooku felt limitation, Sidious perceived threat. The engineer's capacity to end the Clone Wars prematurely endangered decades of manipulation. Without prolonged conflict, there would be no justification for emergency powers, no gradual surrender of liberty to centralized authority. The Sith grand plan required instability. The engineers offered stability. That contradiction could not stand. Sidious began exploring ancient Sith archives, searching for knowledge predating even the Republic, records of civilizations that claimed to shape life itself. Whispers of primordial architects surfaced in fragmented holocrons, references to beings who seeded worlds and reset them when necessary. Whether myth or history, the parallels were unmistakable. If the engineers were indeed such architects, then they had intervened before. And if they had been opposed before, perhaps there existed a method to oppose them again. While political and Sith machinations intensified, the engineers continued their expansion. Entire hyperspace lanes were recalibrated, their routes optimized to reduce gravitational strain and travel time. War-torn planets such as Felucia and Christophsis experienced spontaneous ecological renewal. Even battlefields long scarred by bombardment began to heal, craters filling with luminous vegetation engineered for rapid atmospheric restoration. Clone troopers stationed on these worlds reported in eerie tranquility. The constant tension of combat dissipated, replaced by an almost meditative stillness. Some found comfort in it. Others felt deeply unsettled, as though their purpose was dissolving. The first true moral crisis emerged when the engineers initiated restructuring on a core industrial world without prior incident. Quat, heart of starship production, witnessed its orbital shipyards subtly altered. Massive dry docks reconfigured into sleeker, more energy-efficient forms. Weapons manufacturing lines were dismantled and replaced with infrastructure designed for civilian transport and planetary defense grids. There was no destruction, only transformation. Yet the implication was seismic. The engineers were not merely healing damage, they were preemptively preventing future war. The Republic Navy erupted in outrage. Admirals protested what they perceived as strategic sabotage. Without the Quat drive yards producing warships at full capacity, fleet superiority would collapse. Senators sympathetic to continued prosecution of the war demanded immediate retaliation. But retaliation against what? The engineers had not attacked. They had optimized. Anakin viewed the transformation of Quat as proof of their intent. They were ending the war not through conquest, but by removing the tools required to wage it. Obi-Wan warned that removing tools did not remove desire. Conflict suppressed externally could resurface internally with greater intensity. The Jedi Council dispatched observers rather than soldiers. Confrontation risked escalation. Within the restructured shipyards, Jedi encountered engineers working in silent coordination, their movements precise and unhurried. When approached, they did not flee or resist. Instead, they projected new schematics, designs for vessels intended not for battle, but for exploration and planetary restoration. It was an invitation to a different future. Across the galaxy, ordinary citizens began to experience tangible benefits. Food shortages diminished. Polluted atmospheres cleared. Energy costs plummeted as engineer systems integrated seamlessly with local grids. Public sentiment shifted further. The war, once justified as necessary for security, now seemed increasingly archaic. And yet, beneath the surface of improvement, unease grew. Cultures defined by struggle questioned their relevance in a galaxy engineered for equilibrium. Military leaders feared redundancy. Even within the Jedi Order, younger knights whispered that perhaps the Force had guided the engineers here as instruments of a higher balance. In the shadows of the Senate, Sidious finalized a decision. The engineers could not be allowed to redefine the galaxy's trajectory. If direct assault was futile, then subtle corruption might suffice. He began crafting a plan not to destroy them outright, but to provoke a reaction, an overreach that would reveal them as oppressors rather than saviors. Public perception would shift. Fear would replace hope. And in that fear, he would reclaim control. The galaxy stood suspended between gratitude and apprehension. The engineers' corrections were undeniable miracles. But miracles imposed without consent carried the seed of rebellion. Whether that seed would be nurtured by pride, by fear, or by Sith design remained uncertain. One truth, however, had crystallized beyond dispute. The age of endless war was ending. What followed would determine whether the galaxy emerged reborn, or merely redesigned. Darth Sidious understood something that few others in the galaxy yet grasped. The engineers were not merely altering infrastructure or ending wars, they were rewriting the psychological foundations upon which power was built. The Clone Wars had thrived on fear, scarcity, and division. The engineers were systematically eliminating all three. If suffering diminished, if planetary systems stabilized, if military industries dissolved into peaceful production, then the Republic would have no need to consolidate authority under emergency powers. There would be no empire born from desperation. There would be no thunderous applause welcoming the death of democracy. The Sith grand plan, cultivated over 1,000 years, stood on the brink of irrelevance. Sidious could not allow that. Yet brute force was not an option. The failed Separatist assault had proven that conventional fleets were useless. Even covert sabotage had failed. Specialized infiltration teams dispatched to engineer altered worlds simply vanished, their equipment repurposed into unfamiliar constructs that appeared days later integrated into planetary ecosystems. The engineers adapted not just physically, but strategically. They anticipated hostility with unnerving precision. So Sidious turned to the one domain he believed remained uniquely his, the dark side of the Force. Deep beneath the Senate district, within chambers insulated from prying perception, he initiated an experiment unlike any he had attempted before. Rather than directing raw aggression toward the engineers, he began seeding localized distortions in the Force, subtle tremors of fear and paranoia across carefully selected populations. Entire districts on mid-rim worlds experienced inexplicable surges of anxiety. Minor disputes escalated into violence. Rumors spread that engineer-altered crops were affecting cognition, that biomechanical restructuring carried hidden surveillance systems, that planetary leaders who welcomed the engineers were being quietly replaced. None of it was provable. All of it was plausible. The engineers responded, but not as Sidious expected. Instead of suppressing unrest directly, they began recalibrating environments to reduce stimuli associated with aggression. Urban centers were restructured to create open communal spaces. Atmospheric compositions were subtly adjusted to stabilize neurochemical stress responses. Energy grids were smoothed to eliminate disruptive fluctuations. Crime rates dropped almost immediately. This unnerved Sidious more than resistance would have. They were not reacting emotionally. They were diagnosing causation. Meanwhile, within the Jedi Temple, unease deepened. Masters meditating on Coruscant felt ripples of instability spreading in pockets of the galaxy, yet when they investigated, they found not engineer manipulation but something more insidious, fear arising without clear origin. Mace Windu suspected Separatist interference. Obi-Wan considered the possibility of unintended side effects from rapid ecological transformation. Yoda, however, sensed a familiar signature woven through the turbulence. The dark side was stirring deliberately. Anakin Skywalker stood at the crossroads of these tensions. He had witnessed the engineers' capacity to heal entire ecosystems. He had walked through cities reborn in luminous harmony. And yet now he was being asked to consider that beneath this perfection, something might be wrong. Palpatine, ever patient, began to nurture that doubt carefully. In private conversations, he praised Anakin's foresight, suggesting that perhaps the Jedi's hesitation stemmed from fear of being rendered obsolete. If peace arrives without them, Palpatine mused gently, what becomes of their authority? The seed took root. Across the galaxy, a more tangible crisis emerged. On the industrial world of Corellia, a coalition of shipbuilders refused to allow further engineer modifications to their orbital platforms. Armed security forces blocked access to restructuring sites. For the first time, engineers encountered organized, sustained resistance from civilians rather than military factions. Their response was restrained, but firm. When security forces fired upon approaching biomechanical constructs, the weapons disassembled mid-discharge. Metal components separated into molecular fragments, reforming as inert latticework that drifted harmlessly to the ground. Vehicles were immobilized without explosion. Defensive barricades dissolved into raw materials repurposed into civilian infrastructure. No lives were lost. But the message was unmistakable: resistance was futile, even when non-military. The holonet captured every moment. Public reaction fractured violently. To some, the engineers' refusal to kill proved their benevolence. To others, the disarmament of civilians confirmed their tyranny. Entire sectors polarized overnight. Demonstrations erupted both in support of and against continued engineer intervention. The Jedi Council faced mounting pressure to take a definitive stance. Neutral observation was no longer politically viable. Bail Organa urged dialogue, warning that condemnation without understanding could ignite civil war. Other senators demanded that the Jedi defend galactic sovereignty against what they now openly called occupation. Anakin's internal conflict intensified. He saw the fear spreading. He felt the tension coiling around Coruscant. The engineers could end this instantly, he believed, if they simply explained themselves clearly, if they acknowledged autonomy, if they reassured the galaxy that correction would not become control. But the engineers did not justify their actions. They acted. Obi-Wan recognized the philosophical divide widening within his former Padawan. Peace imposed, he reminded Anakin quietly, is still imposed. But what if it works? Anakin countered. What if this is the balance we've been fighting for? The question lingered unanswered. Then came the event that shifted everything. On Mustafar, stronghold of the Separatist Council, the engineers initiated atmospheric stabilization. Volcanic activity, long exploited for industrial power, began to diminish. Lava flows cooled. Toxic emissions dissipated. Entire mining operations shut down as the planet's crust was reinforced against further extraction. The Separatist leadership interpreted this not as healing, but as an existential threat. Mustafar was their sanctuary. Its instability was its defense. Without it, their secrecy collapsed. Desperation overrode caution. A coalition of Separatist leaders authorized deployment of experimental hypermatter warheads, devices designed to disrupt space-time continuity on a localized scale. The objective was not victory, but disruption, to create a phenomenon even the engineers could not immediately adapt to. The warheads detonated within a partially restructured region of Mustafar's orbit. For a fraction of a second, silence consumed the system. Then reality fractured. A shockwave rippled outward, distorting gravitational fields and tearing open a fissure in hyperspace itself. Engineer constructs within the blast radius disintegrated, not absorbed, not repurposed, but erased. The first successful destruction of engineer technology. But the cost was catastrophic. The hyperspace fissure expanded uncontrollably, swallowing Separatist vessels and destabilizing Mustafar's orbit. Planetary crust ruptured violently. The carefully stabilized environment collapsed into chaotic eruption. Across the galaxy, every force-sensitive being felt it. A scream, not of pain, but of disruption, echoed through the force as the engineers reacted. For the first time since their arrival, they escalated. Massive constructs emerged from hyperspace at the edge of Mustafar's system, structures dwarfing any previously observed. They did not fire weapons. They did not pursue fleets. Instead, they began sealing the fissure in space-time itself, weaving gravitational and quantum forces into a containment lattice. The scale of energy manipulation surpassed anything recorded in galactic history. Jedi Masters watched in stunned awe as the engineers stabilized a rupture that would have consumed entire sectors. Within hours, the fissure collapsed inward, sealed by layered fields of bioengineered matter integrated directly into hyperspace topology. Mustafar survived, but it was no longer volcanic. Its surface cooled into hardened obsidian plains, industry permanently erased. The Separatist Council facility was gone. The galaxy witnessed both the engineers' vulnerability and their overwhelming superiority in the same moment. They could be harmed, but only through recklessness that endangered everything. And when pushed, their corrective measures were absolute. Sidious analyzed the aftermath with cold precision. The Separatists had failed him through impatience. Yet the hypermatter detonation had proven something invaluable. The engineers were not omnipotent. Extreme measures could disrupt them. The key would be precision rather than chaos. Within the Jedi Order, the Mustafar incident forced a reckoning. The engineers had saved the galaxy from annihilation. There was no denying it. Billions of lives remained intact because of their intervention. And yet, their response had permanently altered a sovereign world without consultation. Balance or dominance? Salvation or control? Anakin felt the answer slipping further from clarity. The engineers had protected existence itself, but they had also decided unilaterally what Mustafar should become. As reconstruction efforts began across nearby systems, one truth crystallized. Coexistence was no longer theoretical. The engineers were now woven into the galaxy's survival. To remove them would risk collapse. To accept them unconditionally would risk surrendering autonomy. And in the shadows of Coruscant, Darth Sidious began refining a far more dangerous strategy, one that would not target the engineers' technology, but their understanding of the Force itself. Because if their connection to this galaxy's living energy could be severed, even briefly, then perhaps the architects could be rendered mortal. The next phase would not be fought with fleets or warheads. It would be fought within the Force. The aftermath of Mustafar did not bring unity. It brought revelation. For the first time since their arrival, the engineers had acted with visible urgency, deploying constructs of unimaginable scale to prevent the hypermatter fissure from consuming surrounding systems. They had preserved the galaxy, not selectively, not politically, but absolutely. Entire trade routes that would have collapsed into gravitational ruin remained intact because of their intervention. Billions who would never know how close they came to annihilation continued their lives undisturbed. And yet, Mustafar was irrevocably changed. Where molten rivers once carved volatile pathways across its surface, hardened obsidian plains now stretched beneath a calmer sky. The industrial furnaces that fueled separatist production were gone. The planet had been stabilized into geological neutrality. To some, this was healing. To others, it was erasure. The Jedi Council convened in silence that felt heavier than any debate. The Force itself seemed altered, not corrupted, not darkened, but steadied. The chaos that had rippled outward from the hypermatter detonation was gone, sealed with precise finality. Master Yoda described it as a wound stitched by hands that did not ask permission. Mace Windu described it as proof that the engineers would always prioritize systemic balance over individual will. Both were correct. Anakin Skywalker felt something else. Standing alone in meditation, he reached outward through the Force, searching for the structured presence he had sensed before within the engineer spire. It was still there, vast, geometric, impossibly disciplined. But now it carried a subtle shift. A recognition. The engineers were aware that they had been attacked not by accident, but by design. They had calculated the risk of retaliation and chosen containment rather than punishment. That restraint impressed Anakin deeply. Power restrained was power mastered. Palpatine, however, interpreted the same event as opportunity. The hypermatter fissure had revealed a limitation. The engineers could be disrupted under sufficiently extreme conditions. More importantly, they were invested in preserving this galaxy. That meant they were vulnerable to threats against it. If one could manufacture a crisis severe enough, precise enough, they would be forced into reaction again. And reaction created exposure. But to challenge beings capable of sealing hyperspace ruptures required more than weaponry. It required understanding the mechanism by which they interfaced with the Force. Sidious withdrew further into forbidden Sith archives, delving into knowledge predating recorded galactic history. There, fragmented texts spoke of entities that shaped life across star systems, architects who seeded biospheres, corrected deviations, and withdrew when equilibrium was achieved. One passage, damaged but legible, described a method of disrupting such beings, not through physical destruction, but by inverting the resonance of the living Force around them. If their harmony with it could be destabilized, their precision would falter. It was an act of sacrilege even by Sith standards, an attempt not merely to bend the Force, but to twist its foundational current. Meanwhile, across the Republic, momentum shifted. Worlds once hesitant now openly requested engineer assistance. Agricultural planets suffering from drought petitioned for atmospheric recalibration. Polluted urban systems sought ecological restructuring. Even some mid-rim shipyards voluntarily transitioned to non-military production after witnessing Quat's transformation. The Clone Wars, though not formally concluded, were functionally dissolving. With production lines dismantled and supply chains optimized for civilian infrastructure, sustained military campaigns became logistically impossible. Clone troopers found themselves reassigned from battlefronts to reconstruction efforts, working alongside local populations to integrate engineer design systems. Many felt conflicted relief. They had been bred for war. Now they were participating in restoration. The separatist movement fractured under the weight of irrelevance. Without Mustafar's industrial base and with increasing numbers of member systems defecting in favor of stabilized prosperity, their cohesion eroded. Some leaders attempted to negotiate terms of peaceful reintegration into the Republic. Others vanished into obscurity, unwilling to concede ideological defeat. Count Dooku confronted an unsettling truth. The war he had helped orchestrate was no longer central to galactic destiny. The engineers had reframed the narrative entirely. Political grievances seemed small against the backdrop of planetary rebirth. Even his arguments about corruption and inefficiency lost potency in the face of measurable improvement. And yet, Dooku sensed the growing darkness coiling beneath events. Sidious was planning something. Of that he had no doubt. Within the Jedi Temple, tension rose as younger knights expressed admiration for the engineers' achievements. Some questioned whether the Order's ancient doctrine had grown rigid. If balance could be achieved through intervention, perhaps non-interference had been a mistake. Masters cautioned against such thinking. The Force was not a mechanism to be engineered. It was a living energy to be respected. Anakin stood at the center of that philosophical storm. His loyalty to the Jedi remained intact, but strained. He could not ignore the suffering that had been alleviated in mere weeks. Nor could he dismiss Obi-Wan's warning that autonomy mattered as much as peace. Then came the disturbance. It began subtly, an undercurrent of discord rippling through the Force. Jedi across Coruscant faltered mid-meditation. On distant worlds, engineers paused in synchronized movement, their geometric precision momentarily destabilized. The living current of the Force trembled, as though struck by an unseen dissonance. In his hidden chamber, Darth Sidious completed the inversion ritual. Drawing upon reservoirs of dark side energy accumulated over decades, he projected a wave of corrupted resonance outward, not targeted at the engineers directly, but at the force field in which they operated. The objective was not annihilation. It was interference. The effect was immediate. Engineer constructs across multiple systems flickered, their biomechanical surfaces rippling with irregularity. Planetary restructuring processes stalled. On Corellia, a partially integrated energy grid destabilized, causing localized blackouts. On Ryloth, atmospheric recalibration halted mid-cycle, triggering violent storms. For the first time since their arrival, the engineers were not in control. Panic surged through affected populations. Holonet channels exploded with speculation. Had the engineers reached their limit? Had the hypermatter detonation caused delayed instability? The Jedi Council felt the distortion clearly. Yoda's eyes narrowed in grim understanding. Twisted, the Force is, he whispered. Deliberate this is. Anakin felt it too, but differently. Amid the chaos, he sensed strain within the engineers' structured presence. Not fear. Not anger. They were compensating, redirecting energy, attempting to re-establish harmonic equilibrium. Sidious intensified the inversion, feeding more dark side power into the resonance field. Across the galaxy, engineer constructs began retracting, consolidating around key nodal points as though protecting something unseen. And then something extraordinary occurred. Rather than retaliate outward, the engineers turned inward, into the Force itself. Their geometric presence expanded, interlocking across systems like a vast lattice. Instead of resisting the distortion with force, they recalibrated their own resonance, adjusting frequency to counteract the inversion. The result was not explosion or collapse, but collision. Light and dark currents clashed invisibly across hyperspace lanes. Worlds trembled as opposing harmonics reverberated through planetary cores. Force-sensitive beings fell to their knees, overwhelmed by the magnitude of spiritual turbulence. Anakin found himself standing at the epicenter of an unseen storm within the Jedi Temple. He realized, with startling clarity, that this was no longer about war, politics, or sovereignty. This was about the fundamental nature of the Force. If Sidious succeeded in destabilizing the engineer's connection permanently, the resulting backlash could fracture the Force itself, unleashing chaos beyond calculation. If the engineers overcorrected, they might suppress the dark side entirely, an act that could erase free will as surely as tyranny. Balance hung on a razor's edge. Within his chamber, Sidious felt resistance mounting. The engineers were adapting faster than anticipated. His inversion was no longer dominant. It was being mirrored, neutralized. Fury surged through him. He poured more power into the distortion, risking exposure. And in that surge, Anakin sensed him. For the first time, the source of the darkness was unmistakable. The familiar signature, trusted, respected, now radiated malevolent intent. The galaxy's future pivoted in that realization. Because the engineers had proven they could preserve life. Sidious had just proven he was willing to endanger it to preserve control. And Anakin Skywalker stood between them, feeling the pull of both destiny and choice as the Force itself trembled around him. Anakin did not hesitate. The moment he identified the source of the inversion tearing through the Force, something within him crystallized. For years, he had felt contradictions circling his life, visions of loss, distrust of the Council, Palpatine's quiet encouragement, the relentless strain of war. But this was different. This was not political maneuvering or philosophical disagreement. This was deliberate endangerment of the galaxy itself. The distortion surged again, and across Coruscant, temple spires vibrated with unseen pressure. Several Jedi collapsed mid-stride as the Force buckled in conflicting currents. Anakin steadied himself against a stone pillar, breathing through the chaos. He could feel the engineers compensating, their immense latticework spreading like luminous geometry across hyperspace. But the strain was escalating. If this continued, something would break. He moved without informing the Council. Instinct overrode protocol. Racing through the temple corridors, he commandeered a transport and descended into the depths of the Senate district. He did not need coordinates. The dark side's pulse guided him unerringly toward its source. Beneath layers of political grandeur and durasteel foundations, he found the hidden chamber. The air inside crackled with concentrated malice. At its center stood Chancellor Palpatine, no, Darth Sidious, arms outstretched, eyes blazing molten gold as arcs of inverted force resonance spiraled outward from him like a storm contained in flesh. For a suspended heartbeat, neither spoke. Then Sidious smiled. "So," he said smoothly, though strain laced his voice, "you finally see." Anakin's world narrowed to a single, devastating truth. The mentor who had guided him, praised him, confided in him, was orchestrating a catastrophe large enough to fracture existence. Every suspicion the Council had harbored now stood vindicated. But there was no time for outrage. The distortion intensified, and somewhere in the galaxy, an engineer construct collapsed in a cascade of destabilized matter. "You're tearing the Force apart," Anakin said, his voice steady despite the tempest within him. "I am freeing it," Sidious countered. These interlopers would sterilize the galaxy in the name of balance. They would erase struggle. Erase destiny. Power must be claimed, not engineered. Another tremor shook the chamber. Above them, sirens began to wail across Coruscant as infrastructure faltered. Anakin ignited his lightsaber. The blue blade cut through shadow, its hum a fragile constant amid the distortion. "This ends now." Sidious did not draw a weapon. He was the weapon. Lightning erupted from his fingertips, not aimed at Anakin directly, but spiraling outward to sustain the inversion field. Anakin deflected what he could, advancing step by deliberate step. The chambers seemed to warp around them as opposing currents of the Force collided. Across the galaxy, the engineers responded to the escalation. Their lattice brightened, geometric nodes locking into new configurations. Rather than overpower Sidious distortion, they began isolating it, containing the corrupted resonance in layered harmonic shells. Entire star systems flickered as energy was redirected to reinforce the containment effort. But Sidious had anticipated resistance. With a roar of fury, he drew deeper than ever before, tapping reservoirs of dark side power accumulated through decades of manipulation and death. The inversion surged violently, punching through the first harmonic shell. Shockwaves rippled outward. On distant worlds, structures cracked. Oceans churned. Anakin reached him at last. Their sabers did not clash. Sidious conjured his crimson blade only at the final instant, parrying Anakin's strike with precision honed over a lifetime. Sparks cascaded as blue and red collided, each impact sending tremors through the chamber. "You could rule beside me," Sidious pressed, even as they fought. "The engineers would bow to strength. We would control their gifts, reshape the galaxy as we see fit." Anakin's jaw tightened. For a fraction of a second he saw it. Suffering ended, Padme safe, order imposed without endless debate. But the vision dissolved under the weight of what Sidious was actually doing, risking annihilation to preserve dominance. Outside the chamber, Mace Windu and a contingent of Jedi Masters descended rapidly, guided by the violent beacon of dark side energy. The confrontation they had long feared was unfolding at last. Within the Force itself, something unprecedented occurred. The engineers, unable to fully neutralize Sidious' inversion without catastrophic backlash, altered strategy. Instead of countering his corruption externally, they extended a focused conduit, a single, refined thread of harmonic energy, toward the epicenter of conflict. Toward Anakin. He felt it as a sudden clarity, a cooling precision amid chaos. Not control. Not command. Alignment. The engineers were not attempting to dominate his will, they were offering stabilization, a way to channel the collision safely. Sidious sensed the shift instantly. "They're using you," he snarled, red blades slashing downward with renewed ferocity. Anakin parried, but now he understood. The engineers could not defeat Sidious without tearing the Force apart. But a living conduit, a being balanced between light and shadow, could mediate the resonance safely. The realization struck with profound inevitability. All the prophecy, all the talk of balance. It had never been about destroying one side. It was about integration, preventing either from overwhelming the whole. Drawing deeply, Anakin centered himself between the opposing currents. He did not reject the darkness within him, nor did he surrender to it. He acknowledged it, anchored it, prevented it from spilling outward unchecked. Through that equilibrium, the engineer's harmonic thread flowed, weaving around Sidious' inversion and compressing it inward. Sidious screamed, not in pain, but in outrage, as his storm of corruption began collapsing back toward its source. Lightning lashed wildly, scorching stone and flesh alike. Anakin endured, every nerve ablaze, holding the center as the Force recalibrated around him. The chamber walls fractured. Above, Senate towers trembled. Across hyperspace, the engineers reinforced the containment, sealing fractures in real time. With a final surge, Anakin drove forward, locking blades with Sidious and forcing him to his knees. The compressed inversion imploded inward, folding into a singularity of dark resonance contained entirely within the chamber. There was no explosion, only a thunderous silence as the Force snapped back into harmonic alignment. Sidious collapsed, his physical form ravaged by the backlash of his own corruption. The dark side storm dissipated, leaving only faint echoes in its wake. The engineers withdrew their conduit immediately. Their lattice dimmed to its prior steady glow, restructuring processes across the galaxy resuming with measured calm. Jedi Masters burst into the chamber seconds later to find Anakin standing amid ruin, lightsabers still ignited, breathing hard but alive. Palpatine lay motionless at his feet, the illusion of benevolent Chancellor shattered completely. Across the galaxy, systems stabilized. Storms dissipated. Energy grids rebalanced. Citizens who had braced for catastrophe felt tension evaporate like mist under sunlight. But the aftermath would be far more complicated than victory. The Sith Lord had been exposed before he could execute Order 66. Clone Wars, already dissolving under engineer intervention, now lacked their hidden architect. The Republic would learn that its leader had engineered both sides of the conflict. Trust in institutions would shatter. And the engineers remained. They had witnessed the galaxy's capacity for self-destruction and its capacity for self-correction. They had seen Anakin stand at the fulcrum of light and dark without succumbing to either. For the first time since their arrival, their lattice shifted not in correction, but in observation. The galaxy had proven it could produce balance from within. The question now was whether it could sustain it, without architects. The revelation of Darth Sidious' true identity detonated across the Republic more violently than any superweapon ever could. Within hours, encrypted transmissions from the Jedi Temple confirmed what few could initially comprehend. Chancellor Palpatine had been the Sith Lord orchestrating both sides of the Clone Wars. The war that had consumed the galaxy for years had not been inevitable. It had been engineered, manipulated, sustained deliberately. The Senate chamber, once filled with orchestrated applause and political theater, descended into chaos. Loyalists who had defended Palpatine's emergency powers found themselves scrambling to distance their names from his legacy. Separatist leaders who had believed themselves independent revolutionaries realized they had been pawns in a design stretching back decades. Systems that had sacrificed millions now demanded accountability, not only from the fallen Sith, but from the institutions that had enabled his rise. The Jedi Order stood at the center of this storm. Though they had ultimately uncovered the truth before Order 66 could be executed, the question echoed relentlessly: how had they not seen it sooner? The dark side had clouded their vision for years. Sidious had moved within the Senate under their watch. The public, shaken and grieving, did not immediately differentiate between Sith deception and Jedi oversight. Trust frayed dangerously. Yet amid political upheaval, something remarkable was happening. The engineers did not capitalize on the chaos. They did not accelerate restructuring or assert authority over destabilized systems. Instead, their activity plateaued. Ongoing planetary restorations continued, but no new major interventions began. Their vast geometric lattice remained present in the Force, but quiet. Observing. It was as though they were waiting. On Coruscant, Anakin Skywalker became both symbol and controversy. Holonet broadcasts replayed fragmented footage of the Senate district destruction, of Jedi Masters emerging from the hidden chamber, of medics carrying away the charred body of the man who had nearly become Emperor. Whispers spread quickly that it had been Anakin who confronted him first. Some hailed him as the savior of the Republic. Others questioned why he had been so close to Palpatine in the first place. Within the Jedi Temple, the Council faced its most delicate internal reckoning in centuries. Mace Windu acknowledged openly that had Anakin not intervened when he did, the outcome might have been catastrophic. Yoda spoke privately with him for hours, not as Grand Master tonight, but as one Force sensitive to another who had touched something profound. "You stood between currents," Yoda said softly. "Consumed by neither." Anakin did not feel triumphant. He felt changed. In holding the balance between Sidious inversion and the engineer's harmonic conduit, he had glimpsed the Force stripped of doctrine, neither purely light nor irredeemably dark, but dynamic, relational, requiring conscious alignment rather than rigid allegiance. It was not an easy truth. It was heavier than prophecy had ever sounded. The Clone Wars unraveled rapidly in the wake of Sidious exposure. Without his manipulative oversight, the Separatist Council fractured completely. Some leaders surrendered outright, citing deception. Others fled into obscurity. Droid armies, deprived of centralized command codes, powered down system by system as Republic forces secured control nodes without significant resistance. But the end of fighting did not automatically restore unity. Entire sectors remained economically devastated. Clones, bred for combat, faced uncertain futures. Planets that had lost generations demanded reparations and reform. The Republic Senate, stripped of emergency authority, had to confront structural weaknesses long masked by wartime urgency. It was in this fragile environment that the engineers made their next move. Rather than deploying new constructs, a single massive vessel, larger than any yet seen, emerged into orbit above Coruscant. It did not project restructuring beams. It did not alter atmospheric conditions. It simply remained, luminous and silent against the planet's skyline. Panic flared briefly among the populace, but no systems failed. No infrastructure shifted. The vessel transmitted only one thing: a vast holographic projection visible across the Senate Plaza. The projection displayed two parallel models of the galaxy. One showed continued engineer-guided optimization, planetary ecosystems perfected, hyperspace permanently stabilized, industrial production regulated for maximum sustainability. The other displayed a galaxy governed solely by its own inhabitants, flawed, volatile, but self-determined. There was no spoken explanation, no ultimatum. The implication was unmistakable. The engineers were offering choice. The Senate erupted into the most consequential debate in its history. Some senators argued passionately for continued engineer partnership, citing measurable improvements in quality of life and long-term stability. Others insisted that sovereignty demanded full autonomy, even at the cost of inefficiency and potential conflict. Bail Organa advocated a middle path, limited collaboration governed by mutual consent rather than unilateral correction. The Jedi Council deliberated separately but in parallel. Their role as guardians of peace did not grant them authority to decide for the galaxy. Yet their insight into the Force gave them perspective few others possessed. The engineers were not conquerors. They had proven restraint repeatedly. They had saved the galaxy from Sidious' catastrophic inversion. But they were not of this galaxy. Their perception of balance was systemic, not experiential. Anakin listened to both chambers' arguments without speaking for a long time. When he finally did, his words carried weight beyond rank. "If we accept perfection imposed from above," he said quietly before the council, "we may lose the very struggle that makes us who we are. But if we reject help entirely out of pride, we risk repeating the same mistakes that nearly destroyed us. Balance isn't about eliminating extremes. It's about choosing every day not to let them control us." The final decision required a full Senate vote, unprecedented in scope. Systems across the galaxy participated via secure transmission. The choice was framed not as allegiance to or rejection of the engineers, but as a declaration of intent for the future. When the results were tallied, the outcome was narrow but decisive. The galaxy would remain self-governed. However, formal diplomatic channels would be established with the engineers, allowing collaborative projects initiated by mutual agreement rather than unilateral intervention. Above Coruscant, the massive engineer vessel pulsed once with soft luminescence. Across hyperspace, the geometric lattice shifted, not collapsing, not vanishing, but retracting from direct integration with planetary systems. Restoration projects already underway were completed with meticulous care. Hyperspace stabilization grids were left intact. Ecological repairs were finalized. But new restructuring ceased. Gradually, the visible presence of engineer constructs diminished. One by one, they departed core systems, slipping into deep space along vectors unknown. Their lattice within the Force grew more distant. Not absent, but no longer interwoven tightly with galactic infrastructure. They had accepted the choice. The galaxy exhaled collectively, not in relief alone, but in responsibility. There would be no external architects ensuring equilibrium. The burden of balance returned fully to its inhabitants. For the Jedi, this marked a turning point more profound than any military victory. The prophecy that had shadowed Anakin's life no longer felt like destiny imposed by cosmic design. It felt like an ongoing discipline, an active commitment to prevent either light or dark from dominating unchecked. And somewhere beyond mapped space, the engineers continued their silent observation, having witnessed a civilization confront annihilation, temptation, and salvation, and choose imperfection with awareness rather than perfection without consent. The Clone Wars were over. The Sith were exposed. The architects had withdrawn. What remained was something far more fragile and far more powerful. Peace did not arrive as celebration. It arrived as reconstruction. With the Clone Wars officially concluded and the truth of Darth Sidious laid bare before the galaxy, the Republic entered a period historians would later call the Great Recalibration. It was not merely political reform or economic restructuring. It was existential reflection. Entire generations had grown up believing conflict between Jedi and Sith was inevitable, that the Republic's flaws were unfixable without authoritarian control, that war was the natural state of galactic civilization. Those assumptions had been shattered in the span of weeks. The engineers' withdrawal made that reckoning unavoidable. Had they remained, had they continued refining planetary climates, optimizing infrastructure, correcting inefficiencies, many systems might have deferred responsibility indefinitely. Instead, they left behind completed works and unfinished lessons. Worlds once ravaged by industrial exploitation now possessed sustainable ecosystems. Trade routes once destabilized by hyperspace anomalies flowed smoothly. Energy grids rebuilt with engineer principles required maintenance, adaptation, and stewardship. The galaxy had been given tools, not supervision. On Coruscant, the Senate undertook sweeping constitutional reforms. Emergency powers were permanently abolished. Term limits were codified to prevent the concentration of authority in a single individual. Independent oversight councils were established, composed not only of politicians but of representatives from scientific, humanitarian, and even force-sensitive communities. The exposure of Sidious manipulation had demonstrated how easily fear could centralize power. The new Republic aimed to institutionalize transparency as a safeguard against future tyranny. The Jedi Order faced its own transformation. The war had revealed vulnerabilities not only in their foresight, but in their philosophy. For centuries, they had separated themselves from attachment and political entanglement in pursuit of impartial guardianship. Yet that detachment had not prevented a Sith Lord from rising within the Republic's highest office. Nor had it fully prepared them for the Engineers' arrival, a force neither light nor dark, but systemic. In extended conclave, the Council debated reforms that would have once seemed radical. Greater integration with local communities. Expanded emotional education for younglings to address fear and attachment openly rather than suppress them. Collaboration with non-Jedi Force traditions across the galaxy, acknowledging that the Force manifested through diverse cultural lenses. Anakin Skywalker's role in these discussions was central and complicated. His confrontation with Sidious had prevented catastrophe. His equilibrium during the harmonic collision with the Engineers had preserved the Force from fracturing under opposing extremes. But his proximity to both light and dark currents made some masters uneasy. Yoda, however, recognized something essential. Fear of shadow, he told the Council, creates blindness to balance. Anakin did not seek leadership, yet influence found him. Younger Jedi gravitated toward his candid reflections on doubt and discipline. He did not present balance as serene detachment. He described it as continuous effort, acknowledging anger without letting it command action, recognizing love without surrendering to possessive fear. His experiences had reframed the prophecy once whispered about him. Bringing balance to the Force was not a singular act of destruction. It was an ongoing commitment to prevent domination by either extreme. Beyond the core worlds, reconstruction unfolded unevenly. Some systems adapted quickly, leveraging restored trade routes and ecological stability to rebuild stronger than before. Others struggled with lingering resentment from wartime devastation. Clones, freed from constant deployment, confronted existential uncertainty. Many chose to remain in service as peacekeeping forces. Others integrated into civilian life, forming communities bound by shared origin rather than command codes. The absence of Order 66 left a profound difference in galactic psychology. Jedi and clones did not become enemies overnight. Instead, they navigated an uneasy but cooperative transition. That alone altered the trajectory of countless lives. Years passed. The Engineers did not return in visible form. Their great vessels were occasionally detected at the fringes of deep space, silent and distant, but no new interventions occurred. Hyperspace remained stable. No massive restructuring beams descended upon contested worlds. The choice made by the Senate had been respected. Yet their influence endured subtly. Scientific communities across the galaxy studied remnants of engineer technology left behind with permission, biomechanical interfaces that harmonized with living systems rather than exploiting them. These studies sparked a renaissance in sustainable engineering. Shipyards redesigned propulsion systems inspired by harmonic principles observed in engineer constructs. Agricultural worlds adopted ecological integration models rather than monoculture exploitation. In this way, the Engineers' legacy shifted from direct correction to inspirational paradigm. They had demonstrated what was possible. It was now up to the galaxy to decide how closely to follow that example. Anakin often meditated on the night the Force nearly tore itself apart. He could still recall the sensation of opposing currents colliding within him, the seductive clarity of domination offered by Sidious, the serene precision of systemic balance offered by the engineers. Neither extreme alone had felt complete. Only in holding both without surrender had stability emerged. That memory shaped his approach to every crisis thereafter. When border disputes flared, he advocated mediation before military mobilization. When senators argued for aggressive expansion of Republic authority, he cautioned restraint. He had seen firsthand how easily fear justified control, and how control, once absolute, risked becoming tyranny. Obi-Wan watched these developments with quiet pride. The student who had once bristled against council oversight now navigated complexity with measured judgment. The potential for darkness still existed within him, as it did within all beings, but it no longer defined him. It informed him. The galaxy, too, matured through its scars. Without an emperor to impose uniform order, progress was uneven. Corruption did not vanish entirely. Political disagreements persisted. But the memory of nearly losing everything, to war, to manipulation, to catastrophic inversion of the Force, served as a cultural anchor. Systems were quicker to question concentrated power. Citizens more vigilant against rhetoric fueled by fear. In the Outer Rim, where engineer stabilization had once been most dramatic, worlds became case studies in resilience. Mustafar, transformed from volcanic inferno to stabilized terrain, evolved into a center for geothermal research and historical reflection. Pilgrims traveled there not to witness destruction, but to contemplate renewal. And somewhere beyond mapped hyperspace lanes, the engineers continued their silent traversal between galaxies. They had not abandoned observation. Their lattice, faint but perceptible to the most attuned Force sensitives, remained like distant starlight, present, but not intrusive. They had learned something as well. In witnessing a civilization choose self-determination over imposed perfection, they encountered a variable not easily quantified, the creative volatility of free will. The galaxy they had entered was flawed, volatile, capable of immense darkness. Yet it was also capable of self-correction when confronted with truth. That dynamic complexity held a kind of balance their systemic models had not fully accounted for. The Force itself felt steadier. Not quieter, not less dynamic, but integrated. Light and dark currents still flowed, but the near-catastrophic collision had left behind a subtle memory within its fabric, like a scar that reinforced rather than weakened. Historians would debate for centuries whether the engineers' arrival had been salvation or intrusion. Philosophers would argue whether the Senate's choice had been wise or reckless. But one fact remained unchallenged. The galaxy had faced extinction not once, but twice, first through endless war, then through the manipulation of the Force itself, and survived by choosing balance over domination. Not perfection. Not control. And in that choice, the Star Wars galaxy did not become flawless. It became conscious. When the engineers entered the Star Wars galaxy, they did not arrive as conquerors. They arrived as architects of balance, beings who could silence storms, stabilize stars, and correct ecological collapse with effortless precision. In the midst of the Clone Wars, their power seemed like salvation. Entire worlds were healed in weeks. Hyperspace was secured. Industry was reshaped into sustainability. For a galaxy drowning in conflict, perfection felt within reach. But perfection came with a question. Was peace still meaningful if it was engineered from above? Was balance still authentic if imposed without struggle? The arrival of the engineers forced every faction, the Republic, the Separatists, the Jedi, and the Sith, to confront what they truly valued. Count Dooku saw his revolution rendered irrelevant. The Senate saw its inefficiencies exposed. The Jedi saw the limits of their doctrine. And Darth Sidious, unwilling to relinquish control, nearly tore the Force itself apart in an attempt to preserve domination over destiny. It was in that moment, when the dark side sought to invert reality and the engineers sought to systematize it, that Anakin Skywalker fulfilled the deeper meaning of balance. Not by destroying one side. Not by surrendering to the other. But by standing between them and choosing restraint. The Clone Wars ended not with annihilation, but with revelation. Order 66 was never executed. The Empire never rose. The Republic reformed itself under the weight of truth rather than fear. And the engineers, having demonstrated what flawless harmony could look like, withdrew when the galaxy chose autonomy over optimization. That choice defined the future. Without external architects ensuring equilibrium, the burden of balance returned to living beings, imperfect, emotional, volatile beings capable of both terrible destruction and extraordinary growth. The Force remained dynamic, not sterilized. The light did not erase the dark, and the dark did not consume the light. Instead, both currents continued, demanding vigilance, humility, and conscious choice. In the end, the engineers did not reshape the galaxy permanently. They revealed what it could become, and trusted it to decide. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all. Balance is not something imposed. It is something chosen.
The multiverse doesn't end here. New invasions, new empires, and new worlds collide daily. If you enjoy deep cinematic, what-if scenarios like this, subscribe and join Multiverse Galaxy If.